Good afternoon and welcome to the first HR Livewires webinar with movers and shakers from the world of HR. So first up today is James Devine. James has worked in the NHS for 20 years now, rising through the ranks of HR to become Executive Director of HR and OD at Medway NHS Foundation Trust. James has got a big reputation for high performance and brings a wealth of knowledge from working in some of the most challenging and largest NHS organisations in the UK. He's got extensive experience of successfully leading change management, workforce redesign and complex employee relations matters. He's also led multi-million-pound cost improvement programmes. He's got a passion for research and evidence as the basis for change and increased credibility for HR. James is one of the rising stars of HR in the NHS and has also picked up some awards along the way, as well as writing regularly for the HR press. So welcome, James.
Thank you. What a great introduction.
And you've been in your job now for 3 or 4 months.
Yes.
How's it going?
It's going really well. We'll talk as we go through, but there's no doubt it's a challenging role. The volume is big, but equally, I think it's a really challenging agenda at the moment, the workforce agenda.
Good. Well, we'll hear more from James over the next 40 minutes or so. So, welcome to those who have joined us. You'll see if you're on Click Meeting that there's the opportunity to ask questions and to chat. So, I'll be keeping an eye out for any questions that you have. Please do send them to us. If you've dialed in and listening on the phone, then you can text me questions on 07515 520 726. That's 07515 520 726. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get on to the first subject, which is leadership. And there's been a huge amount of turmoil and change in politics over the last year with the Brexit referendum and US election. And a lot of the debate seems to be at odds with what we do as HR professionals in the workplace. We celebrate diversity, we create shared purpose, we really believe in honesty and building trust. So what are the leadership lessons that we can take from current politics?
So for me, I think there are core things, and as you said, they all are prevalent in the work that we do and how we sort of teach and educate managers across the organisations that we all work in. I think trust is definitely the first one. And you talked about various political agendas both in the UK and overseas, and we've seen over recent months how that trust can be almost manipulated to a degree about which groups of people you're talking to and being sort of trustworthy to a point that satisfies what they want to hear. Whereas I think what we've got mixed up, I think, over the course of however many years, is that this word truth has almost lost its sincerity. For me, as a HR professional, being candid, there's a skill to that, which we all have and we all learn as we develop. But what we can't continue to do, I think, is manipulate that truth to the point that, as I say, it loses sincerity. I think the second thing linked to that is around credibility. So you ask any HR professional in an interview setting, one of the things that they would want to be known for is credibility. And for me, credibility and truth are linked. You can't be trustworthy and be candid if you don't have credibility, and you don't have credibility if you're not trustworthy. Even if you think about the very sort of junior levels within HR, that's where you're beginning to build your credibility. As you get more senior, you need to be more trusted, essentially, because the credibility grows with you. I think the third thing for me that we learned from the points that you mentioned, Norman, around Brexit in particular, around leadership, I think is about committing to what we said we would do and delivering that with pace. So disregarding for a second whether we agree or disagree with the outcome of that. Voters heard a really clear set of principles and a set agenda that they voted for, and that hasn't happened. Even as recent as this week, where we've heard what that plan is. The plan is still immature in its delivery. There are no timescales really attached to it. So all those people that voted this way or this way, they haven't actually got what they voted for. And I guess that goes back to my point about how that truth gets manipulated to the point that the sincerity of what people voted for is gone.
Well, one of the interesting things I think is about, because you mentioned truth quite a bit there, is about what people perceive as truth. And I don't think politics has changed that much, that people always want to hear what they want to hear, they believe what they want to hear, and maybe politicians have got better at telling people what they want to hear, and getting sufficient numbers of what we would say is good leadership in the workplace, that truth is really important. So maybe we should learn something. Maybe to be controversial for a moment, as HR leaders, maybe we should be telling people what they want to hear rather than telling them the truth. So
I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I think that's the manipulation point again. I think if we tell people, what they want to hear, eventually that comes home to roost. I think personally, I think part of being in HR and being seen as that credible partner to the organisation is about being candid, and is about being upfront when you can be. It isn't about simply satisfying the masses or satisfying a group of people. And we all know, we've all been in those situations, I'm sure, where it would be easy to effectively mislead those people and get out the door as quickly as you can and just tell them something they want to hear. But it comes back round. So I absolutely wouldn't be an advocate of simply satisfying people and telling them what they wanted to hear. I think part of HR's role is about being candid. It's about truth, and we have lost that a little bit along the way.
Okay, and big challenges in the NHS just now. There's a lot, obviously, front page everywhere. Lots of conflict, political conflict about management of the NHS, seemingly conflict within the NHS, different professional groups, and so on. So what are the leadership skills you think that you need as an HR director? What's really important just now in what appears to be quite a time of crisis?
Yeah, okay. I think agility is probably the big skill that I've, you said at the beginning, 3 months in the role. I think the ability to be agile with what you do. And for me, I think one of the biggest lessons around going into the director role is that there are 2 roles. You have a role in which you are responsible for the running of the HR function and all the workforce points that come as part of that. But more importantly, as part of the exec director role, you're part of an executive team that runs the hospital. It's responsible and accountable for running the hospital. So the agility point is that you have to flex, and sometimes you're expected to be in this space, and other times you're expected to be in this space. And you don't get that when you're in a deputy role, for example. You are expected to understand the running of the hospital in its very broad sense. So the ability, I think, to be agile in that is absolutely the core skill for any sort of person progressing into that director role. I think the second thing around that skill would be managing your time in terms of from a leadership perspective. It's very easy just to attempt to try and fix everything, but actually good leaders will set the vision, they'll set the strategy and stick to it. Again, going back to your previous question around the consistency, if you like, in that message. If you picked up a manifesto from any political party when they were collecting votes essentially, and said, as an output, have you delivered on what you set out to do? I think you'd be fairly disappointed at the number that you could tick off and say, yeah, we've achieved that. I think that's a contrast in healthcare. I think we're held to account much more about delivery than perhaps some of our political parties.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's move on to the next subject we're going to talk about, which is how to make it into an HR director job. You've just got there, haven't you? So what are the key traits that you need to really work on to make it to become an HR director?
I think resilience definitely is something that is a really key skill about that you learn along the way, but equally becomes more prevalent, I think, in whether it be deputy or director role, but more so in the director role. I think it is also about understanding as much of the role that you can before you actually go into it. So, when we worked together, it was around, for me, it's thinking about your next few steps ahead and about planning for all the gaps that you've got and doing what you can now to plug those gaps. So, when you're a deputy and you're asked at the director interview, can you tell me about your level of board exposure? Lots of deputies don't have that. So, my advice, if you're in that deputy role wanting to progress into that director role, your development plan should be about seeing where all of your gaps are that are expected at director level and get them as best you can, through shadowing, mentoring, deputising for your director. I've always been sort of very lucky in the sense that the directors that I've worked with, we've always been quite clear about what I wanted to do long term. So they've been really supportive, or I would say, I'm quite happy to go to that meeting, or I'll represent you at this. And, I've had that autonomy to do that. But I think you get that, I think, about, agree your development plan, but be honest about where your gaps are.
It's good to have honest feedback, though, isn't it? Because it's not always easy to spot your own weaknesses, and actually going out there and asking for feedback, even if you don't particularly like how you hear sometimes, is important.
Yeah, but again, I think if you take the relationship that you have with your deputy or your director, I think it's almost like that phrase when sometimes a good friend is telling someone something they don't want to hear, and I think there is a role to play for mentors or coaches supporting people to challenge, respectfully challenge, but also say, if you were to go through this this role description and be honest about where your gaps are. If you have no exposure at something, then be honest and say that's a gap. When you're in interviews and you're asked about strengths and weaknesses, we sort of soften the word weaknesses now, but I would say it's sort of lesser strengths. They are weaknesses, identify them and do something about them. Don't sugarcoat them. They are gaps. That's what you just be honest about. We've all got them. But I think progressing into that director space is about identifying them, being honest about what they are, but then being really clear about your plan, about how you're going to address them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I agree, and I think that the things that I would spot are the big gaps for people coming up that you need to address are, you've got to be strategic, you've got to really think strategically, be able to do that. You've got to be able to operate at that higher level, you've got to have confidence to do it. And then you've got to have that understanding of the whole organisation and not just HR. And I think that's often difficult for HR professionals when they're making that step up, but really important to give. It's not only giving yourself credibility, but it's actually making that additional contribution over and above your specialty.
I would agree with that. The only thing I would disagree with in what you just said was around that term strategic, which we just overuse now. If you go back 5 or 10 years, you would hold a strategic role in the organisation. That meant that you would contribute to the running of the organisation as a director. Now we talk about strategic recruitment or strategic HR, strategic ER. You can't strategize at every single level in the organisation. So we've almost weakened the term strategic. But actually the point is right, we should all be working at that strategic level in director role particularly. But I think because of the way it's been softened and weakened, for me it has less meaning now. So it's a term that I don't particularly use a lot.
Yeah, it's a good point, because people, I always remember in a previous role that they wanted to upgrade a meeting, and so it suddenly became a strategic operational management meeting. There you go. I guess what I meant by that was you've got to have an opinion about what the direction of the organisation is, and have it be well informed, and that's strategic. But I get completely to the point. So let's go back a few years, Jay. And imagine yourself 10, 15 years ago. So what advice would you give yourself with all the experience you've had over that time?
So it's a good question. So I think the first thing in terms of advice would be to someone just stop and take the time to reflect on your learning. So I think the thing with HR rather, is that it is a bit like a hamster wheel. You are quickly moved on to the next thing. And when we talked earlier about learning organisations, and if you think of yourself, as a learning organisation, in terms of planning your career, all those attributes of a learning organisation ultimately are about reflection, honesty, taking the time to think about the good bits and the bad bits. So if I was looking back, I think one of the lessons would be for me just sometimes just to stop, pause, reflect, adapt and evolve really. Whereas I think it was very fast-paced and you just expected to move on to the next thing. I think networking, it's become more prevalent, I think, to the point now where everyone holds sort of networking events. But actually, I didn't do a lot of that in my sort of more junior roles, and I think it is about getting out there. It is about building your network. And social media helps with that now. It's more prevalent now than probably it ever has been. So I would, my point about evolving is taking all of those things about how you work. And it's almost a bit like how you manage your own brand, I suppose. Particularly if you're someone who's career-minded, you want to get your brand out as far as you can. But a lot of that is through networking. And so that, for me, that would be something I would look back on and think, did I do enough of that to position myself with the right people, the right organisations? And then the third part is listen. There are people, as you said, that will give you the honest feedback. Don't dismiss the honest feedback. And I sort of have this little anecdote now where I say that when people give you feedback, you can disregard about 10% of it, because 10% of it will either not be relevant to you, or it will hurt you too much to hear it. You reflect on that, but the other 90% will always be valuable feedback, and mostly done with good intention. And take the time to listen to the feedback, and it will help you. If I look back now, there are things that I listened to at the time. There are equally things that I look back now and think, oh, actually, I should have listened a bit more to that person telling me that, because they're absolutely right.
It reminds me of a 360 feedback that I had some time ago, where somebody, a colleague, wrote that Norman makes staff feel fearful and scared.
Yeah.
And I kind of reflected on that and thought, is that actually true, or is it? So I think you're right. You've got to. I think the thing with any sort of feedback is that you've got to be open to it and not react to it emotionally. I mean, even though it can be quite tough, but have that ability to discern between what actually is constructive and reasonably or accurate, and what's just people having a go.
I think particularly if you're asking for feedback by way of 360s, for example, the mistake that lots of people make with 360s is because you pick the people that you know are going to give you nice feedback. So when they give you more constructive feedback, it hurts even more, because you thought you're going to have this great 360.
Yeah.
My advice would be, where you've had those difficult relationships with people, pick those people for the 360, because they won't be unkind just to be unkind. They'll have reflected on those situations, and they'll give you the positives about it. But equally, they'll say, this is how it made them feel, or actually this person did this a bit more. Their credibility would be better. So I think with 360, if you're going to use stuff like that as a feedback tool, don't simply dismiss it. It's a bit like you with a comment. I remember having a 360 about 5 years ago, where one of the feedback points says, James has no time or interest for anybody he doesn't like or rate. At the time I was thinking, I do have high performance standards for the teams that I need, but at the same time, as I reflect, it's about thinking, how do you support those people to bring them with you, rather than simply saying, they're not going to get to the level that you need them to be at. So, again, your question about what advice would I give myself would be, have more patience with individuals and support them to the point that you can take them on that journey with you, as opposed to simply cutting them off and kicking them to the curb, saying, I don't think you're going to make it, I'm not going to even try supporting you.
It's a really interesting point, because there's almost like a status of being somebody who doesn't suffer fools gladly.
Yeah.
That's a sign of great credit to have that. And I'm really, I think maybe in certain circumstances that's right, but in the workplace as a leader, I can't see very many situations where that's right, because every time we have an interaction with someone, especially if you're a more senior leader, they're looking to you for guidance, for an image almost of what things should be like, and you're not going to get people to perform better or be more interested in what they do if you're not taking much interest in them.
I think the scary point almost comes with that element of positional power, where people assume that when you go into the director role, that you are scary because you're the most senior person. But actually, as we said before, being in that director role doesn't mean that you know everything.
Yeah.
And having that ability to be sort of a bit humble with it, I suppose, and to be a bit more human, I think is a great attribute as opposed to using that positional power for bad, I suppose.
Yeah, as long as it's genuine. It just reminds me of that song. It's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way.
Yeah.
So I think it's about having that self-awareness to realise that that's never going to be the case. Okay,
Yeah.
let's move on to research. Now you've done some research on lookism in recruitment, so tell us more about that.
Yeah, so lookism is a relatively new term, I suppose, to describe things like unconscious bias or words to that effect. And what I wanted to do was really push the conversation a bit further, and almost sort of prompt thinking. So what we did was a case study of about 100 recruiting managers, and we asked them a series of questions about whether how a candidate looked was a precursor to competence, I suppose, or role suitability. But the questions were designed in such a way that in some cases we were asking the same question but in a slightly different way. So there's an element of sort of psychometric to it. And the intention for us was to, as I say, educate individuals about the fact that it's natural to have views on how someone looks. It goes back to when my granddad would be talking about interviews, and he would say, make sure you polish the back of your shoe, because when you go out, that's what people see. So people always have a view of candidates. If a candidate arrived in your interview with bright pink hair, you would remember the candidate as having bright pink hair. And with this research, we wanted to push past that and say, how do people feel about it? Is it a precursor to role suitability? And because it was anonymous, it allowed people to be, I think, much more honest. So we did the research at the end of last year, and so I did that with Paul Wilson, who is an HR manager in the NHS. And as I said, we sent it out as a case study, anonymous survey, and the results were fascinating.
So tell us more about the results then. What did you find?
So at the beginning, we asked respondents, is appearance important in the interview? And overwhelmingly, pretty much all of them, about 80% of them said, yes, it is. When we said, is it a precursor to role suitability, or have you appointed anybody as a result of their appearance being not as you would expect? And of course, they all said no, wouldn't dare do that, because that's what they thought they ought to say.
Yeah.
But actually, then as we went through some of the other questions, it became more apparent through the types of questions and responses that we had, that there are particular characteristics which turn people off as recruiting managers. So we had a list of 13 attributes, some which are covered under the Equality Act, some which would be discriminatory to make decisions on, and then other things which had no legal standing in terms of discrimination. And what was really prevalent is that all those things which were covered by the Equality Act didn't really feature. And that was a good thing, I think, about this research, is that we honestly talked about the things that people do take issue with, I suppose, when they look at candidates. So the big reasons why people potentially wouldn't appoint someone would be things like tattoos and piercings. Interestingly, on the flip side, some of the positive things that people talked about were nice clothes, shoes, and nice teeth. So there's a complete contrast in what people think is acceptable. The point about tattoos and piercings was a really interesting one, because in more recent research, it talked about how some celebrities have almost made tattoos popular. I think of people like David Beckham, who people look up to, covered in tattoos. If that person went for a job interview covered in tattoos, some recruiting managers, clearly from this research, would have a big issue with that, to the point that they actually wouldn't appoint them.
Are there circumstances where you think that might be reasonable? I'm thinking of, for example, if your customer base is a certain demographic, and I'm trying not to do stereotypes here, but a certain demographic that perhaps would really look down on people with tattoos, very visible tattoos or piercings, that would feel that that's not the sort of people that they would want to be serving them. So I think there are circumstances where a recruiting manager or an organisation could even have a policy that says no tattoos because our customers don't like them.
Yeah, well, there are. I think that exists. I think there are absolutely organisations who would have very clear sort of dress code policies that would almost, I guess, legitimately say we wouldn't recruit someone who had a tattoo of an eagle on their cheek or something, or had nose studs and stuff like that. So I think it does exist. I think that practice is prevalent. And certainly, what this research showed was that does happen. People do make recruitment decisions on things like tattoos and piercings. Are they legitimate with some organisations? Potentially, yes. Just because you've got a policy on it now doesn't necessarily mean that life hasn't evolved to the point, as I said, people like celebrities who make tattoos popular and they make piercings popular. Otherwise, all we'll end up with is policies which are in a particular stereotype, which might have been written 10, 15 years ago. If you think about the sort of emerging workforce of the future, if you looked at percentage terms of how many people have tattoos 10 years ago compared to now, I would guess that stat would be much higher now. So we're almost working on policies which have a stereotype of 10 years ago without accepting that maybe life has moved on.
Yeah, I think there's two things in this for me. One, the first is about, I suppose part of the reason for your research is are we missing out on really good, high-performing people because we're judging them on their appearance, when actually it's not that important. But the second is, I wonder what it says about where prejudice sits, and I mean more the subconscious prejudice, because I'm sure most people will work very hard to not exhibit any prejudice, even try to kind of contain their subconscious prejudice in areas like ethnicity and gender and disability and so on. But maybe because it's not covered by legislation, things like lookism are well, actually, you might say you don't want to do it, but it's actually, if you do it, then who's going to be bothered about it?
Exactly.
So what does that say about that individual and their ability to kind of make good decisions?
So for us, when Paul and I set out to do this, one of the aims was about using the research findings, and actually, as you described, the research findings are such that there is a potential that we're losing out on a particular skill set of individuals because they might have a tattoo. But what I think what it showed is those decisions are absolutely prevalent, and that future workforce, I think, if we stick with what we've got in terms of those policies and stereotypes, we'll miss out. I think in terms of using those research findings, certainly what we've just done at Medway is use it as an opportunity to educate. So often, as you said, in terms of discrimination and prejudice, it's often so heavily punitive when people get it wrong. And actually, sometimes people get it wrong because there's a lack of education about diversity and inclusion, prejudice, discrimination. And if you looked at training around it, lots of the training is very much based on you will do this, you will do this. And that's not me suggesting that that's right or wrong, it's simply saying that's a reality of how we manage discrimination and prejudice in the workplace. So what we've done is and said, with this research, it should act as a prompt, a gentle nudge to say, when you're making a recruitment decision and you see a candidate in front of you with a tattoo, don't automatically exclude that candidate's thoughts. It's just a gentle nudge. And for us, this is the beginning of, I guess, our equality agenda or our inclusion agenda to say, let's use that as an opportunity in terms of the spirit of a learning organisation to educate people better, rather than simply saying, you got this wrong, so therefore this is the punishment, if you like. We need to move away from this punitive approach. And that's what this research is designed to do.
Okay, good. Just a reminder that if you've got any questions for James, please put them in the chat section of the Click Meeting site, or you can text me on 07515 520 726. That's 07515 520 726. Okay, James, you've talked a bit about research, your own research, but we know that you're also very keen on using research in practice as well. So it can be tricky though, can't it, within HR, because there's a lot of management gurus out there with a lot to say, a lot of opinions, and even some fads out there as well. So how do you go about distinguishing between what actually works and is backed by evidence and what's a fad and to be avoided?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think there are lots of fads out there. I think social media helps with that, I suppose. We're probably all victim of it to a degree. You know, when we write blogs, they are our opinions, so we're sort of piggybacking off the back of fads and discussions, and very rarely back it up with any sort of research. And I think the only trick I would say is that if you look back at past research, more recent in the last 5 or 6 years I'm talking, what you'll see from those research papers is lots of recommendations and lots of findings. And what these fads, as you say, don't do is take account of that research. And the reason why those research papers are still relevant is because no one's done anything with them. So if you take the lookism, one is a good example. This came about from a conversation with an HR journal where they were talking about lookism. And they said, similar to what you just said, is it just a fad? Well, it isn't just a fad. It's a terminology issue in terms of prejudice, discrimination, lookism. But if you linked lookism right back to the Equality Act or research around prejudice, discrimination, what you'd find is that a whole host of people have done lots of work about recommending various things to organisations, yet no one's done anything with those recommendations.
Yeah.
And for me, that's what makes research still relevant, from particular research, as I said, from the last 5 or 10 years. On the flip side, there's research of people like Michael West is a good example, where pretty much the whole of the NHS uses his research. My question would be, are we using that as actual research? If you picked up an HR strategy, you'd find those words from his research in there about engagement and high-performing organisations. But you might question, they're just fads. They're just words.
Yeah.
They're not underpinned by anything else, because we've taken Michael's particular research and said that's now the Holy Grail. And actually, it's actually really good research. My challenge is, are we using that research in a way that the findings and the recommendations are intended? And I would say that we're not, and we're all guilty of that. So we kind of take bits of the research that we like, and then they become fads, because we actually aren't using the research in the way that the people who undertook it intended.
It can be tricky though. I was thinking about what you're saying about Michael West, and I remember one of his important bits of research was about the impact of organisations that do annual appraisals, and that's linked to lower rates of mortality.
Yeah.
And yet, if you go and look at another eminent academic like Professor Rob Browner, if I was doing this the other day, 5 things HR should stop doing. One of them is annual appraisals. Yeah. So you kind of get these conflicts, don't you, between eminent academics about appraisals really important because it's linked potentially to organisations that have lower hospitals have low mortality. So other ones saying don't do it. Yeah. So what's, how do you see your way through that? Because that can be quite confusing, can't it?
Yeah, it can. As I said, I think it's about taking the research findings and doing something systematic with them. So we talk a lot about OD, and I'm not touching on that today, but OD is about taking an issue, diagnosing it, having a really clear set of design principles, and an output which changes something. So my challenge would be take that research and do something which is going to change culture. So it's not it's not a fad that can fix something in 6 months, because culture isn't something that changes in 6 months, for example. But also take the research and make it meaningful. And so Professor John Purcell's research around nurses in particular, and it's a no-brainer, where he says, paraphrasing, if you don't develop nurses and support them with those management skills, when they get into senior roles where they do less nursing and more management, they are poor managers. Shocker. That's obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
But how many trusts have taken, well, not just NHS organisations, but how many organisations take that research and say, we're going to put a really innovative, creative program together. Not very many. We created a fad of it and have development programs for nurses where we teach them about sickness absence, performance management. That for me isn't about preparing those people to go into what might be a chief nurse role in the next 5 or 10 years, for example. So for me, take the research and do something meaningful with it. Don't just take snapshots of it. So with the Michael West stuff, we talked about appraisals, high engagement, low mortality and low turnover. Well, I know at least one organisation that bucks that trend completely in the NHS, where they satisfy all of those things but actually have high turnover. So my point is, we can't just take a snapshot of the research and say that is now the truth. We must all abide by that, because it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I think diagnosis is the key, isn't it? To do that, really understand your organisation and what the problems that you're actually trying to solve before you do anything else. Just a minor technological issue here that we'll hopefully sort out. There we go. Well, we've got a question actually from one of our delegates, which is, what's your favourite bit of research that you use?
Yeah, so I've used this for a little while now, and it's a study from IES Studies from 2008, and it's called What Customers Want from HR. And it's still relevant today, because we haven't done anything meaningful with it. And what it talks about is exactly what customers want from HR functions. Have a look at it. It's really easy to understand because it's written in such a way. It probably wasn't written by an HR person. It's easy to understand. But there's a diagram within it, and it talks about 3 facets. It talks about HR functions that are bogged down in admin processes. It talks about HR functions which are bogged down in policies. People don't want that. It goes back to your word that you used earlier in strategic HR. But in simple terms, what people want is what they call people partners. They want HR professionals to actually partner the organisation. You understand the organisation. And people who know me will know that I use this phrase of good HR people understand HR, but brilliant HR people understand the organisation that they're working in, because they immerse themselves in the organisation. I did a test the other day from our HR team, and they just said, how many beds does this hospital have? And some of them knew, but a lot of them didn't know. For me, that's basic understanding of data, which allows you to understand your organisation, which in turn makes you a better HR person. It prepares you for that director role we were talking about earlier, because you get that breadth. And a lot of HR professionals don't do that. They're stuck in that silo of, I'm an IT casework, or I'm a learning and development specialist. Well, push yourself. All learning, good learning, comes from being outside your comfort zone. So if you want to develop, push yourself into that new space. Don't just sort of sit there and think, I'm in my sort of HR bubble, so therefore everything's fine. Because that, for me, is outdated HR. You need to absolutely immerse yourself. Your partner isn't just senior partner. For me, every HR professional can partner the organisation in some way.
But you've got to understand the organisation to
absolutely.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Okay, in the last couple of minutes of this webinar, let's look at kind of concentrated on the NHS and your experience. But imagine for a moment that you are HR Director of UK PLC. It's a bit of a challenging time for UK PLC at the moment. Low wage growth, lots of uncertainty out there, productivity is poor compared to competitors, increasing mental health outlook. And so what would you prioritise if you had that ability to, or that role? What would you prioritise and how would you go about doing it?
Yeah, okay, good question. I think communication, certainly. We talked at the outset, didn't we, about sort of political agendas. We talked about trust and truth. For me, communication is something that we don't do enough of. And certainly as an HR director at UK PLC, it would be wanting to immerse yourself in the organisation and just communicate with being candid. Put yourself in people's shoes to address some of those issues. So if we have rising mental health issues, where's that provision within UK PLC to manage that? But accepting that when you have a large number of issues, you're not going to fix all of them. So pick out three or four things and do them well. So for me, communication would be one. The well-being agenda, but in its broad sense of listening to people and making them stay healthy at work and being at work. The pay stuff, the constraints will always be there. As simple as saying pay people more money because they'll stay, because research tells us that doesn't happen. And educate people. Become that learning organisation. That would be they're my big things that I would want to do as an HR director. But make it, as I said, meaningful to people.
Okay. Thanks, James, and thank you very much for all of your contribution today. And thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. We have recorded the webinar, so we will be distributing it and putting it out there in the next couple of days. And if you want to discuss any of the topics with me or James, or find out more about what we do at Gallanach, then an email will be sent later today with all of our contact details. So just a final thank you to James.
Thank you, Norman.
And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Goodbye.